Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be around the city, across the state. Welcome back to another exciting day in e-learning. And today we're going to talk about Era of Good Feelings and early Western expansion. So we leave off here with the War of 1812. It was kind of our last really big event, right? And so the way the War of 1812 ends, it's a tie. The United States really kind of loses this war, but there's the Battle of New Orleans, final battle. After the war is over, Andrew Jackson wins this battle, launches his career, and America decides that they are, in fact, the winners of the War of 1812. And whenever you win, you feel really, really good about yourself. So this ushers in a time that's known as the Era of Good Feelings. And the Era of Good Feelings is just it is kind of this feeling of victory, of strength, of nationalism and unity. And so President James Monroe is going to become the president associated with this. But a good way to think about kind of this era is to think about the Revolution. 13 different states kind of fighting kind of under one flag, but there really was not a United States of America. But now the United States has fought under the Stars and Stripes. They defeated a European power, Britain. And so this idea of the United States is starting to become a lot more popular than this idea of my state. And so when President James Monroe is inaugurated, he gives a speech in which he basically kind of encapsulates this whole idea. Which he says, if we look to the history of other nations, we will never find a people so prosperous and happy. Our government is near to perfection. We cannot fail under the favor of a gracious God. We have a high destiny that awaits us. And so this really is kind of a feeling that the United States is emerging perhaps as a world power and certainly as the great nation of the future. And so within this background, a lot of those political party infighting goes away. People become very, very nationalistic. The national anthem is written. Francis Scott Key's, the Star Spangled Banner becomes a song sung around the country. This is also going to lead to a tilt towards favoring the U.S. government over state governments. And because America believes that it won the War of 1812, they're going to start being very aggressive towards other countries, coming very close to war and threatening war in a lot of different ways. And so kind of this era is interesting. It's an era of kind of optimism, of unity. And so all these fights that are eventually going to resurge and cause the Civil War for a very brief period of time. Americans kind of revel in the victory and forget about kind of all of the tensions that have characterized American life pretty much since the founding. And so in this era, we have a couple of instances where the federal government becomes a lot more powerful. And both of these are worth talking about. So let's talk about the National Bank again. So we talked about the first bank quite a lot. And that one's going to die a natural death in 1811. Democratic Republicans don't want it, so they just let it expire. But during the War of 1812, in order to, raise an army, a navy, all this stuff and fight, you need money. And the U.S. had a lot of problems without a national bank to help broker all of those deals. And so the thought was, after the War of 1812, to bring back the national bank in order to deal with all of these problems that the country had experienced during the war. But the controversies didn't go anywhere. People still are concerned this is going to favor the wealthy. They're still concerned there's nothing in the Constitution about a bank. And so this turns into the argument like, well, if it's not in the Constitution, then the state governments, right, reserve powers, should be the ones making the bank. And so we have a Supreme Court case. So early on in the story, the Supreme Court has to kind of decide a lot of these boundaries. Where does state power begin? Where does federal power begin? And so in 1819, the state of Maryland is going to try to kill the national bank. Basically, it's challenged in court. So what Maryland argues is that this bank is unconstitutional. And so therefore, Maryland can treat it like any other bank. And so they actually tried to tax this bank. So you have a state taxing the federal government and trying to force it to pay a state money. And so in this case, McCulloch v. Maryland, the Supreme Court had to decide whether or not the bank was allowed. And so they decide, yes, the bank is allowed, and there are two key parts of this decision. The first one is that after McCulloch v. Maryland, states are not to interfere with the federal government. No state can interfere with the federal government and get away with it. This is something as simple as no state can mess with the post office. But in this case, it's no state can mess with the national bank. This is also the court case that gives us the idea of implied powers, that the United States government can have powers perhaps beyond what was specifically written in the Constitution. And so they base that on the part of the Constitution called the necessary and proper part. And so the necessary and proper part says this: the Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, yada, yada, yada. What this means is that if the government is supposed to do it, then they're allowed to make anything that might be necessary and proper for them to carry out that duty of government. So really great examples of implied powers today. Best one is actually going to be the military draft. Nothing in the Constitution gives the federal government the power to draft you. They implied it later. If you don't pay your taxes, technically the government can't do anything to you. It's not in the Constitution. So they implied that later. And we still have a national banking system today, and that has been upheld under implied powers. So once the government can imply powers, they're obviously going to then be able to increase what they can do, and by doing that, increase their power. So the implied powers doctrine, McCall v. Maryland, National Bank, very important moment in U.S. history. Another really important Supreme Court moment is going to be in 1824, a case called Gibbs v. Ogden. Again, you don't need to know all the details about this one. It was basically two guys who were suing each other because they were both operating steamboats on the Hudson River. Well, the Hudson River is a river that goes across state lines, New Jersey and New York. And so these two guys were arguing which government, the state or the federal, gets to decide the rules on the river. And so what the Supreme Court said was very, very simple. It said that the federal government, and only the federal government, can make laws about business, we call it commerce, between the states. And so we call this interstate commerce, right? Interstate and commerce being business. And so this includes today waterways, roads, railroads, pollution laws, kind of anything, any sort of business that's going to happen in more than one state or across state lines, that's going to be the federal government being involved. And so what this means is now the federal government is a lot more involved in business, in commerce. And so examples of that today are actually, you guys know very well. Minimum wage is a Commerce Clause law because a lot of companies pay, across state lines. Federal minimum wage, they're allowed to do that. Meat Inspection Act, FDA drug testing, all stuff that is based on the Commerce Clause. Toilet and light bulb efficiencies, environmental protections, gun legislation that bans things like bump stocks and automatic weapons. All of those things are actually justified under this idea that the federal government gets to make the laws about business activity that happens in more than one state. And so Commerce Clause, Gibbs v. Ogden, huge case to improving the power of the federal government. Which brings us to outside of America. So inside America, favoring the federal government over the states. Outside of America, United States is going to get super aggressive. So let's talk about Florida. So in the year 1818, Florida is still a colony of Spain. It's still technically controlled by Spain. And so the border between the United States and Spain is down in Georgia. But what was going on in Florida at this time was something called the Seminole Wars. And so a chief called Osceola had led a very successful war against the Spanish government and then against American slaveholders in Georgia. And they were using Florida to raid the United States. They were very successful. And so in 1818, the United States sends in General Andrew Jackson of the U.S. Army to invade Florida, to attack and defeat the Seminoles, take over the Spanish towns, and ultimately force Spain to give up Florida. And so by the end of the American invasion during the Seminole Wars into Florida, Spain had given up control to the United States. Now this is super risky because let's think about this. You go into Spain's territory and you're attacking Spanish towns, you put your army in there. Technically, this could have caused a war with Spain. The United States acted very aggressively, feeling very strong after the War of 1812. And so Spain does not call their bluff. Spain gives up the territory, and the United States continues the Seminole Wars. Fun fact, to this day, the Seminole tribe has actually never surrendered to the United States Army. Fun little fact there. So outside of just kind of what's going on inside of what we call now the United States, we have all sorts of world events going on, and a lot of events going on south of America, of the United States' border. In 1821, the Mexican War for Independence ends, resulting in independence for Mexico. By 1826, almost all those Latin American countries had thrown off Spain for the first time. You have a ton of new countries, and so the United States is seeing this, right? They were colonies that won their independence, and they're seeing this change, and so the United States decides that it's going to jump into the world at this time. It jumps into this world with something called the Monroe Doctrine. So doctrine is something you believe and it guides your action, right? Like church doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine is just President Monroe's foreign policy. And his policy towards the world is going to be this, that American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by Europe. And so what this means, very simply, is the United States is willing to intervene, militarily, go to war, if any European power tries to recolonize the Americas. And so this kind of on its surface seems like a very altruistic, kind of very positive thing, right? United States is going to protect the independence of the Americas from their European colonies. And that's kind of how it starts. Spain had lost control. The United States is supporting independence movements. And the real reason this happens is because European powers are considering reinvading Latin America. Britain is talking about this with Spain and France. Like everyone is talking about, do we reinvade the Americas and recolonize them? Well, the United States wants to prevent that from happening. They see an opportunity to push Europe off the stage and for America, the United States, to be the leader of all of the Americas, both north and south. However, long term, this causes problems. Long term, the United States kind of takes this idea of we will protect the Americas and kind of turns it into we will control the Americas. And so some things coming down that are going to be influenced by the Monroe Doctrine. America is going to invade Cuba in the Spanish-American War, but we're not going to give them their independence. We eventually create an independent state in Panama in order to build a canal for the United States to control. During the Cold War, events of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the coup in Chile, the El Salvadorian massacres, School of the Americas, all sorts of things that America is going to get involved in based on this idea of the Monroe Doctrine, that the Americas is to be led by the United States of America. And if any other country gets involved, the United States will defend that hegemony, that control over this part of the world. And so the Monroe Doctrine, very important to understanding the way that things are going to go in the future. And so that kind of wraps up the general just era of good feelings. And so if you're watching this video in 2 sittings, now is the time to kind of take a little break and leave it for the next time. But I'm going to continue on if you guys are. So last thing to talk about today is just going to be this early era of Western expansion. Some things that we're going to have to talk about that are happening just over the course of about 100 years from 1800 to 1900. So US after the Revolution, not that big. Basically, the western border is what is Illinois, is going to be the western border of the land the United States wins from Great Britain. Very quickly, that land gets settled, right? It's new land, people are coming in, the population is exploding. And so in 1787, the first real kind of like big round of new states is going to be created. This is going to be called the Northwest Territory. And basically all this does, it is the first time America sets down rules for adding new states. Because we're going to start adding a ton of new states as America kind of surges westward. Another really important thing here is that slavery is banned north of the Ohio River. So we now in America have, after the Northwest Ordinance, slave states and free states. And there is a physical border, the Ohio River, between them. This is where we're going to get north and south from, is from the Northwest Ordinance. And so as part of the Northwest Ordinance, 1818 folks, right, the Illinois becomes a state. But in the 1780s, what we know as Chicago is founded by a man named Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sablé. And this guy set up a one-room trading post on what is the Chicago River. and that was the founder of our city, at least as far as our Chicago goes. And so the Midwest cities, they don't grow very fast, very quickly. Chicago in 1820 is barely a city. It's not even close. You just have you have a fort, Fort Dearborn, a couple of cabins, a couple of farms. And so this is going to take a little bit in order for kind of the Midwest and the West to get filled out. So we add a bunch of new states, a bunch of new territories here, and here's kind of why. Reasons you expand are pretty straightforward. You got more people and you want more money. So two things affect population growth. One, babies are getting born. Era Good Feelings is a great time for expansion, people having big families, but here's the bigger one. Immigration in the United States starts picking up in this era, and it's going to stay very, very high. The idea of immigration in the United States reshaping the country is going to be a big theme. We've already seen it once. We're going to see it again. But on the other hand, there's also money involved in here, right? More land, more resources equals more money. More people equals more need for jobs equals more economic growth. So there's a lot of reasons to do this. There's reasons that you want to expand. So just a couple of quick items here. Louisiana Purchase. Hopefully we know about this, but in 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power in France. He immediately wants to go to war and has no money to do it. So he sells all of France's holdings in the Americas in one fell swoop to Thomas Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase. Doubles the size of the United States like that, and this is what really sparks that idea of weight. The United States should be a continental power from sea to shining sea. And that's really where this is going to come from, is from the Louisiana Purchase. Well, once you have all that new land, you got to have somebody go explore it. And so if you don't know the story of Lewis, Clark, and Sacagawea, you should look it up because it's a really cool story. They walked, they canoed from St. Louis all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's a really cool story. They surveyed it. They had to get around the Rocky Mountains. All sorts of really cool stories in here. So if you're an explorer type, check that story out. It's a really cool one. So here's a stat for you. Year 1800, only 387,000 settlers west of the Appalachian Mountains. By 1820, 2.4 million. So Western expansion is like an explosion. It happens really, really fast. And so these people that go out there, they're different. They are not Northerners. They are not Southerners. They are Westerners. They have a different idea. They have different attitudes, different understandings of life, different politics, different economics. And so these people, everybody from settlers just trying to have a farm to trappers, traders that are like setting up, Chicago and St. Louis. You got immigrants who, they have a chance for, another life. And so these people, because of where they live and how they live with each other, are going to have very different political views. Much more self-sufficient, much less trusting of, banks and money and everything else. A lot of these pioneers also, too, they're going to be hostile towards slavery because a lot of them see the West as an opportunity for kind of every man to have their own piece of land. But obviously, you can't have Western expansion without displacing the people that are already there. And so America, from its very founding, begins a series of Indian wars. In order to clear out the Northwest Territory, kind of, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, they have to defeat all the native tribes. A lot of these tribes get together. They form kind of an Indian coalition to oppose the United States. And so they actually resist for a really long time. But by 1795, these Indian tribes have been mostly defeated by the United States Army. And so the Treaty of Greenville kind of ends that first era of Indian wars. And then there was the Shawnee Wars, led by a guy called Tecumseh and his brother known as the Prophet. And this tribe, the Shawnee, they refused the Treaty of Greenville. They refused to surrender. And so what they did was they allied with the British and they allied with British Canada in order to organize tribes to resist American expansion. The British provide them with military supplies, provide them with logistical support, kind of all the things that you would supply like a rebel army, right? And so kind of Britain's goal of this was to create an actual Indian state, like a nation that was United Tribes of America. And so the Shawnee Wars actually they're a part of the War of 1812. They're actually very successful. They capture Detroit, they capture a bunch of other places, but ultimately in 1813, the U.S. Army has a showdown with this coalition, the decisive battle, the Battle of Tippa Canoe, and after this battle, the Shawnee Confederation is going to fall apart. And so that's kind of going to be the story of a lot of Indian resistance. They're going to organize, they're going to fight, but on the long enough timeline, they're going to lose. Fun fact too, Americans love Indian killers in this story. William Henry Harrison is going to be one of 2 presidents that is elected solely on their fame for like fighting Indians and doing other things like that. And so that's just kind of a little cultural connection there, that the heroes of the Indian Wars, they're American heroes. So back to Chicago, Fort Dearborn, 1803. In the War of 1812, Tecumseh's army destroys Chicago completely. The Potawatomi tribe attacks Fort Dearborn. They kill everyone, less than 100 people, but they wipe out everyone. They burn all of what is then Chicago to the ground, and Chicago ceases to exist. But then in 1816, the fort is rebuilt, and Chicago begins rebuilding. So, folks, the Chicago Fire was not the first time Chicago was destroyed. It was destroyed in the Fort Dearborn Massacre. And if you ever make your way down to Michigan Avenue, the bridge over the Chicago River, if you've ever seen this sculpture is actually a kind of homage to the Fort Dearborn Massacre. It's called The Defense. Next time you're down there, check it out. There's a plaque, The Battle of Fort Dearborn, The Defense, Chicago Connection. So lastly, folks, what we got here is just a little bit of expansion. 22 states are going to be formed up to the year 1820. And so you see some of these are northern, some of these are southern, and so we're going to get into the politics of those states a little bit later. So what's motivating all of this culturally? We got kind of the money thing, we got the political thing, so let's talk about the cultural idea. So manifest destiny is a really important idea in American history. And it's a simple idea. It's the idea that the United States has some type of like God-given destiny to expand from sea to shining sea, that God's, chose America to be the great nation that expands over the whole continent. So those are kind of their goals. The goal here is that like the United States needs to expand as much as possible. The bigger the better, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so it's based on kind of 3 ideas. The first is this American exceptionalism idea. America is better. We have better government, better people, better everything. And that idea really is still around today, right? USA #1. Second is this idea that because of our virtue, because we're better, we have a mission to make everybody else better. And so therefore, we have this mission to spread our beliefs across the world. And then lastly, that we have a God-given destiny, that God has chosen America to bring these virtues out into the wilderness and out to the world. So a lot of manifest destiny is about bringing civilization into different places, the light of civilization. And so the United States has a few eras of expansion. We're going to talk about Texas and Mexico, a couple other things, but this is a process that's going to continue for about half a century until the 1850s. But by the 1830s, early on in the story, the United States is already involved in what we're going to call Indian removal. And that very simply, children of God, is the forced relocation of Indians from their ancestral lands to reservations west of the Mississippi. So the idea of this, open up these Indian lands for American development. That's all it is. It is a get those Indians out so American settlers can come in. And the government does a lot of different things in order to try to civilize the natives. One of the most interesting of these was Indian boarding schools, where children were kind of taken away from their parents and put in these schools where basically they were only taught English, they were taught Christianity. And so it's this attempt to kind of rub out the native culture and replace it with the more civilized American culture. And so the consequence of all this, and we'll look at this also a little bit later in the class, is that Indian reservations and American Indians, they still have the worst outcomes of any group of people in the United States. And that goes back all the way to the 1830s. Yeah, it does. And kind of one thing to kind of look at here is there's been a lot of attempts over the years to try to like preserve culture. And one of the most interesting is the Crazy Horse Memorial. Crazy Horse was a native leader who, after his tribe was defeated by the U.S. Army, someone mocked him and said, "Where are your lands now, Crazy Horse?" And he simply said back that my lands are where my dead are buried. And the idea that kind of the history of the land, trying to preserve that, keep that alive, is something that a lot of modern American Indians are very concerned about. How do we keep this legacy alive? that we know this other civilization existed, had heroes, had culture, and that's something that we're still struggling with in America today. So one of the most interesting and most famous instances of Indian removal, we'll talk about the politics of this when we talk about Andrew Jackson, was the Trail of Tears. Costing this Cherokee tribe 4,000 lives. It's really the last tribe on the east of Mississippi that resists relocation. They're going to be forced out. That being forced out is going to cause mass amounts of death. And the reality of the Trail of Tears Indian removal is most Americans are going to support it. Very few people are going to call out the government on this treatment of the natives, going against treaties, because the interest in moving the natives out are going to outweigh this idea that they could be included as Americans. And so they're always going to be seen as the other. And so the Trail of Tears today, you can still follow it. It's a very devastating kind of story that will kind of go back over. And ultimately, after the American Civil War, Indian wars are just going to continue until there's almost none left. The Homestead Act is going to encourage people to move west. We're going to have a series of Great Plains Wars in the 1860s through the 70s, the Comanche Wars, the Apache Wars. And so the United States is going to be founded with its on Western expansion. It's going to become our great myth. It's going to become our great, America is the West. But it comes at a price. And it's a very, very high price that we still today really haven't looked at the ultimate cost of. And so we hear stories of cowboys and Indians, of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, but ultimately the outcomes for Native Americans, they're going to matter. But it's all going to be a consequence of the idea that they do not see Native Americans as a part of the United States. They will always be the other, the outsider, the savage. And so as Indian wars rage on, as America spreads kind of across all these lands, they also set their sights on other places. And so the next time we're going to come back to Western expansion, we're going to have to talk about the war over Texas and then the Mexican-American War that's going to be motivated a lot by slavery, by Western expansion, and by this idea of manifest destiny. So have a great rest of your day, folks. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you in class.